Hi, everyone. Sorry for the delay. Welcome to this morning's press conference at the Jerusalem Press Club. I'm Talia Dekel-Fleissig. The IDF has renewed its attacks in Gaza and now is also targeting Khan Yunis, another stronghold of Hamas located in the Strip South. At the same time, Israel is carrying out a diplomatic campaign meant to extend its credit to fight the terrorists while dealing with the looming threat from Hezbollah in the country's north. Today, we host Eylon Levy, a spokesperson for the Israeli government, who will provide a current briefing of the situation from Jerusalem, and then he'll take questions from reporters. A reminder for those of you who are used to our previous format to use the Q&A box, please, and include your name and outlet. Hello, Eylon. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Good morning. We're now in the second chapter of the October 7th war. The first chapter began with the October 7th massacre and continued until the hostage release pause. And then after 7 days of the hostage release pause, Hamas decided to violate its terms, hold on to the women and children it was obligated to release, and resume rocket fire against Israel. Hamas started the war on October 7th, and it resumed the war on December 1st. And now, as the army wraps up the job of defeating Hamas in the north, and we are talking about close quarter fighting. I know sometimes the situation is depicted as if it's an Israeli bombardment as opposed to actual battles on the ground with armed groups. We're moving south, and we're moving south to continue erasing the whole of Hamas infrastructure in the Gaza Strip, all of its terrorist infrastructure, all of its governing infrastructure. They're going after every tunnel, every commander, because the goal of this war is to totally destroy Hamas, total victory over the terror organization that perpetrated the October 7th massacre. And as we do that, we are, of course, combining military efforts with diplomatic efforts. And I would dispute the characterization at the beginning that Israel is launching a campaign, a diplomatic campaign, to try to buy credit, because this time the world understands that the conflict is very different. This isn't another campaign in which Israel is trying to cut Hamas down to size, the so-called mowing the lawn strategy of previous years, cut it down to size, gain deterrence, and then buy a few years of peace and quiet. This is a war that when it began, Western nations immediately understood and said very clearly, there is only one way this war can end, and that is with the end of Hamas. It's why President Biden has been standing foursquare behind us since the beginning of this war with moral, material, and diplomatic support, saying this war has to end with a new reality in Gaza. It cannot end with Hamas in power. It's why we had the British Prime Minister here in Tel Aviv standing next to our Prime Minister, sorry, I think that was in Jerusalem actually, saying the UK wants Israel to win, because countries around the world understand that this isn't a local dispute between Israel and armed Palestinian factions. The destruction of Hamas is a vital national security interest for the nations of Europe as well, and also for the Arab world. We have not heard the sorts of condemnations that you might have expected in previous rounds, and that is a reflection of the fact that Arab capitals, even those nations that are unable to speak openly in support of Israel's campaign for Hamas, understand that this war has to end with the total defeat of Hamas. They understand Hamas within the Arab world as being an extension of the Iranian imperialist project, together with Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthis in Yemen and the other militias in Iraq and the Assad regime. They understand that is part of Iran's strategy of entrenching itself across the region, projecting its power and aggression. And they also understand Israel has to end this war with the defeat of Hamas. And in Europe as well, the United States and Canada, these nations understand that as grim as the images are on our screens right now from the fighting in a war that I'm surprised sometimes I have to keep reminding people in every interview, Hamas started the war, that Hamas has chosen to fight from densely populated areas. We didn't choose the war. We didn't choose the timing of the war. We definitely didn't choose the battlefield. They understand that the consequences of inaction would be much worse, that an army of terror cannot perpetrate an atrocity like it did on October 7th and get away with it. Because if it does, that emboldens Islamist extremists and terrorists all around the world to think that they can attack democratic states with impunity and get away with it, especially when we see expressions of sympathy on the streets of Western capitals in London, Paris, Berlin, people chanting from London to Gaza will have an intifada or globalize the intifada. This is a domestic extremism problem calling for violence on the streets of Europe that would only gain encouragement and succor if this war ends with anything other than the total defeat of Hamas. So we're moving ahead with the second stage now, a second stage that is going to be difficult militarily. We are talking about, again, not a question of bombardments from the sky. Israeli Air Force activities are, of course, hugely important, but we are talking about armed battalions of Hamas fighters, and our soldiers are having to engage them in close quarter fighting. That's why we've seen over 400 military casualties, the vast majority in the initial onslaught on October 7th, but Israelis are now used to the daily update on their screens of the salt of the earth of our country falling at the age of 19, 20, 21. Engaging in difficult fighting and continuing with a very difficult mission of trying to protect civilians, which is a very difficult task because Hamas's strategy is based on human shields. That is Hamas's strategy. It is to deliberately embed itself under schools, under hospitals, under mosques, under homes, so that it can attack Israeli women and children and then hide behind Palestinian women and children and try to evade justice. And our strategy is to go after the entirety of Hamas terror infrastructure, wherever it is. None of it will be immune. None of the perpetrators of the October 7th massacre will be immune. And to do that, we're trying to get civilians out of harm's way. Now, that is challenging under circumstances in which Hamas is urging people to stay and martyr themselves. In some cases, is physically preventing people from leaving. And that is why the Israeli army opened what we're calling the Human Shield Hotline, where Palestinians who are being held as human shields can call the Israeli army and say, hey, we're not being allowed to leave here. You should know. Please try to get us out. Don't attack this area. It's why we're making other efforts to try to protect civilians. But again, a challenge. It's a challenge when international aid agencies, instead of supporting efforts to evacuate the north, try to impede them. We saw the World Health Organization trying to call for an urgent evacuation of hospitals under fire, hospitals that Israel had been saying for months we wanted to get people out of northern Gaza before the ground invasion. And instead of sending people to the designated humanitarian zone, an open area where Hamas has not embedded itself inside and underneath civilian infrastructure, and setting up serious shelters for people to escape there, we've seen Hamas, with the complicity of aid agencies, funneling people into densely populated urban areas that are already bases of Hamas activity. So the challenge of protecting civilians is intense. It is upsetting for us that sometimes our efforts to protect civilians are mocked or discarded or discounted. We saw a lot of international calls to make sure that the IDF is operating with precision. So the IDF is operating with precision and released an interactive map dividing the Gaza Strip into very, very, very tiny small subsectors so that we can warn the population where the fighting is going to take place. Okay, surrendering the element of surprise. We've given up on the element of surprise, where we can warn the civilians where fighting is going to take place so they can get out and we can target the infrastructure Hamas has built under the civilian infrastructure. And then to see that being mocked or discarded as being dystopian, or people raising questions about how are they supposed to access the maps when there's no internet, even though everyone in the media knows there is internet, because how else are you getting these reports out of Gaza, is upsetting. And so as we move forward, we would of course like to see greater appreciation for the unprecedented efforts that Israel is taking to try to protect civilian lives in very, very difficult circumstances of a counterterrorism operation in urban areas. We didn't pick the battlefield. Hamas has picked the battlefield, and we're trying to make the least bad out of the situation. And more scrutiny as well of the information coming out of the Gaza Strip, based on an understanding that there is no such thing as a free media in Gaza. There is no such thing as an independent journalist in Gaza. This is an authoritarian regime that controls the flow of information out of Gaza. The camera people who are operating on the ground, whether they're actively complicit with Hamas or simply cowed by it, know that they are not free to tell the whole truth about what is happening there. It's why they will never release images that are inconvenient for Hamas. And, you know, I have just some examples. I just pulled this up on my phone just now of bizarre headlines that have been coming out where we need to see greater accountability about the claims that Hamas is putting out, sometimes laundered by international institutions, which are able to put a UN stamp on it, that then prove out to be totally false. But of course, the damage is never corrected. So, I'm looking here, for example, a tweet I
Mr.
put
Levy, I
out.
do want to leave a bit of time for questions because I know that your time is short.
I'll just wrap up. I'll wrap up this point. These two headlines were published a month apart. On the 16th of October, we see a BBC headline: fuel reserves at Gaza hospitals likely to run out in 24 hours. Of course, those fuel reserves don't run out because we know that on the 16th of November, a month later, there's a headline: Gaza faces communication blackout due to lack of fuel. Now, how was Gaza only going to face a communication blackout due to a lack of fuel if a month before the hospitals were about to run out, and if we know that there are still communications coming out of the Gaza Strip, as we all saw from those images of civilians, like in that scene from Game of Thrones, mobbing the hostages as they're being released from the Gaza Strip, filming everything on their phones, all the TikTok influencers inside the Gaza Strip still live streaming things because there is no communications blackout. And it's important that when media go along with these claims that are coming out either from Hamas or via UN institutions that have been complicit with Hamas, and they realize that they've been lied to, have a little bit more skepticism about the quality of that information and the quality of the sources that are feeding them that information. So on that note, I'll now take 10 minutes of questions, and then I'm afraid I have to run to another interview.
All right, well, thank you very much for your time so far, and we'll use what we can of what's left of it. Newsweek, David Brannon from Newsweek is asking whether you think Israel will follow, if Israel will implement the U.S. expectation of not striking in areas in southern Gaza as the IDF advances, or following through on not striking. Is this a reasonable expectation given the tactics employed by Hamas and other armed groups which you've already touched upon?
The aims of this war have been clear from the moment that the war cabinet set those goals, and that is the total destruction of Hamas's governing and military infrastructure inside the Gaza Strip. And our leaders have been very consistent that there will be no hiding place, no refuge for any Hamas terrorists. And in order to target them, we are going to uphold our obligations under international law to do everything we can to get civilians out of harm's way. But international law is designed to mitigate the horrors of war. It is designed to make nations fight with one hand tied behind their backs, absolutely correctly. That is what it should do. It does not force nations to fight with both hands tied behind their backs, and it does not grant immunity to terrorists just because they choose to operate out of protected facilities. On the contrary, international law provides the circumstances in which those protected facilities lose their protections when they are used for terrorist purposes. And so we are going to continue with our campaign to destroy Hamas, a campaign that the United States sees eye to eye with us about the strategic objectives of this war, that this war cannot end with Hamas still standing simply because it is choosing to hide behind women and children. And within that, we're of course continuing to constantly improve our efforts to protect civilian lives. We're seeing the precision map of southern Gaza. That wasn't something that was in place with the campaign in the north. It is an improvement that we're doing on the move in order to improve our MO and protect civilians in the south. And we're learning from the United States as well. We said from the beginning of this war, Hamas is worse than ISIS. We'll destroy Hamas like 86 nations banded together to destroy ISIS and deprive it a territorial stronghold 10 years ago. And as part of the assistance we've been getting from the Americans, there's been an ongoing military dialogue with their generals as well, where we're learning about what they did in Mosul and Raqqa and how they improved, for example, from Fallujah to the battles of Mosul in order to try to root out ISIS. And any constructive feedback that we get, any serious military strategic advice about how to target Hamas while minimizing harm to civilians, we will of course mention. But that constructive feedback has to be consistent with the goals of this war that Israel has set, and that the United States is completely shoulder to shoulder with us on, that it is to target Hamas and destroy its terrorist infrastructure in the Gaza Strip, and not to give it blanket immunity because it is deciding to act in flagrant violation of every principle of humanitarian law and every norm of humanity.
Very clear. I'm taking us out of Gaza just for a minute, and then we'll go back to it with the time we have left. Kamyar Behrang from Iran International TV is asking you to expand on discuss the expansion of Iran's influence in the region. Is there an official plan from Israel to counteract this and prevent a potential third wave of the war?
Our strategy at the moment is to contain this war to Gaza and to focus on fighting the terror monsters who perpetrated the October 7th massacre. We're not interested in fighting a war on two fronts, and to that end we have put up serious deterrence against Hezbollah in the north with a massive call up of reserves, backed up of course by the serious force projection from the United States, in order to send a message to Hezbollah and anyone thinking of entering this war: don't. The consequences of a full-scale war for both Hezbollah and the state of Lebanon will be severe. Hezbollah will be making the mistake of a lifetime. We are not interested in fighting on two fronts at once. We want to destroy and bring to justice the monsters who perpetrated the October 7th massacre. We know that Hamas launched that massacre with a much grander vision than it has been able to achieve. It wanted to spark a regional conflagration, calling on Palestinians in the West Bank to grab guns and knives and join the fighting, constantly trying to egg Hezbollah into a full-scale war, other regional proxies around the region, and we're trying to stave that off, focus on the Gaza Strip, and not expand this into a regional conflict. And we're grateful that the United States has sent that force projection into the Middle East in order to make that very clear as well. We are going to destroy the Iranian proxy in Gaza, and we're focusing on deterrence against anyone else thinking of entering this war.
Thank you. Another question from Nick Pisa from the Daily Mail. He's asking whether you can expand on the Khan, the Israel broadcaster report from Sunday, saying that the Shin Bet, or maybe it was Mossad, will track down Hamas leaders abroad and assassinate them. And I'll add another half a question in terms of Turkey, because Erdogan already threatened Israel against taking any action against Hamas operatives, senior operatives in his own country, and whether that should be a consideration to Israel in any way in terms of its actions.
Our leaders have been very clear that every Hamas terrorist is a dead man walking, and the monsters who perpetrated the October 7th massacre will be brought to justice. And I think Israel has proven before, most famously with the abduction of Adolf Eichmann from Argentina in 1961, which, by the way, scandalously, the United Nations condemned that as a violation of Argentina's sovereignty, that anyone who thinks of hurting our citizens or abducting our citizens, we will go to the ends of the earth to bring our citizens home to safety, and we will go to the ends of the earth to bring to justice the people who think they can employ genocidal violence against the Jewish people. Now, exactly how and in what circumstances we're going to continue with our campaign to bring to justice the October 7th monsters, I can't elaborate at this stage, but we are clear there will be no impunity for the monsters who on October 7th sent death squads into our kibbutzim and southern Israel in order to burn, behead, torture, mutilate, and rape as many Israelis as they could find.
Very clear. And you were clear as to the IDF's main goal of eliminating Hamas, but Israel still has many, many hostages in Gaza. So a couple of questions that I'm summarizing together.
137.
137 hostages in Gaza. How is this part of Israel's goal to get them free? If you can say anything about Israel's plans to flood the tunnels, are they taking into consideration that that hostages may be there? And another question about the Palestinians that have been released from Israel. If you know, if as part of the previous deal, if you know what's happening with them, is there any attempt to monitor them after they've been released from jails? I've combined a whole bunch of questions together. I hope you have time to answer them all.
Sure. I'm not going to be able to answer all of them because I am going to have to run for another interview now. As for the questions about the tunnels, the IDF is, of course, employing a range of engineering measures, and I can't comment on operational measures that they are using or may be considering. The other question was about... I'm sorry, you asked me 3 questions and I wasn't able to jot them down.
About the hostages themselves, how
the hostages, yes. So this war has had 2 goals from the beginning: the release of the hostages and the destruction of Hamas's capabilities. And the strategy that the war cabinet has pursued has been to put unrelenting military pressure on Hamas to create the conditions where Hamas is willing to release hostages. We know that the inhumane terrorists who perpetrated the October 7th massacre have no compunctions about holding children as hostages, holding hostages for a very long time. I think Gilad Shalit was in captivity for over 5 years. We still have hostages dating back to 2014, Avera Mengistu, Hisham Assaid, and the 2 MIAs who were killed in 2014. And the strategy was to put unrelenting military pressure on Hamas to a position where it wants to release hostages. And that's what we saw with the hostage release pause. We clobbered Hamas. We had it begging for a breather. Hamas wanted a few days to catch its breath. And in exchange for giving it time to catch its breath, we received 110 hostages back. Now, I don't know whether, as journalists, as citizens, how optimistic you were at the start of this war that we were going to get nearly all the children, except for the 2 Bibas children Hamas now claims are dead, back home. I can't say safely because the families are revealing horrifying details about the psychological scars of that child abuse that they experienced. But that strategy has proven itself. The option of standing by the sidelines and hoping Hamas would release them or asking them nicely or diplomatic pressure was never going to work without unrelenting military pressure. And we're continuing to apply that military pressure now. And in as much as there is a serious possibility to get hostages back, including the 20 women and the 2 children Hamas hasn't released despite its obligations, we will, of course, want to get them back, even if that means, or when it means, putting in place a temporary pause in order to facilitate getting them out. In Israel, this is maybe something that escapes the coverage. This is a very personal issue, because 240 hostages in a country of 10 million people means everyone knows at least someone who has had someone stolen from them. I discovered just last week an old army colleague of mine, his brother-in-law is a hostage in the Gaza Strip, and we're going to continue putting military pressure to get everyone out, not just the women, also the men, because their lives are worth no less, not just the young, but also the old, not just the civilians, but also the soldiers who we put in harm's way in order to defend our country. The goal is that there will be no one left behind. And I can tell you, from a country where people have not been sleeping properly for the last 8 weeks, sick with worry for what has been happening in Gaza, it's not just a slogan. Honestly, none of us are free till all of them are free and we get all of our hostages home. That's why we'll continue putting military pressure on Hamas. And on that note, I'm afraid I have to run because I have another interview starting in 2 minutes.
Eylon Levy, thank you so much for your time. And
thank you very much, everyone. Keep safe, and hopefully we'll all meet in better circumstances sooner rather than later.
Absolutely, amen. And I'll just remind those on the line that we have another briefing tonight at 8:30 p.m. Israel time with Israel's most recent National Security Advisor, Dr. Eyal Hulata. Please check your inboxes. Have a great day.